Hey everyone, so welcome to the second video of the series. This video is going to discuss all the background context that surrounds this study we're talking about this summer. And we are going to get into the deep end today, so just hold your breath. All right, so let's start with the first page of the paper. If you have the paper with you, go to the first page. It contains the title and the authors and investigators. So who ran and wrote this study and where are they from? Now, as you can see under the title, there's a laundry list of investigators here. So it's a pretty substantial study. And looking at the text on the top left, you can see that these investigators were mostly from academic institutions, from Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., and they come from what looks like the departments of pediatrics, biostatistics, public health, and otolaryngology, which is ENT, ear, nose, and throat, okay? And the two lead investigators, which we see on the bottom left there, Hoberman and Scheik, I'm sorry if I have pronounced them wrong, are physician scientists from these institutions, all right? So now who funded this study? Let's look at that. And this is something that really matters here. So I'm looking at the last page of the paper now. So flip to the last page, top right, where it describes their funding sources. So all published studies must disclose their funding sources, along with any industry sources of support for the individual investigators too. Okay, and so we see that here, right? The highlighted portion, it describes the funding source of the study, which was essentially funded by the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, which is a part of NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, right? So it's an NIH-funded academic project, which is usually the least biased of medical studies. And a little bit down below, a few of the investigators also disclose conflicts of interest or individual industry support. And so why do you think this would be important in studies like this? Well, it has been shown that industry funding of studies actually can skew the results of those studies toward the product that they manufacture, okay? So here is an example of an industry funded study with bias, okay? So it's a review, this is a review showing that sponsorship bias, which is the phenomenon that occurs when a pharmaceutical company or a medical industry company sponsors or funds a clinical trial, right? And there's proof in this review article that the results of these trials overwhelmingly end up concluding favorable results towards the funding company's medication or product. So that's really important. So there's bias going on here, even if it is implicit. So this happened in the past with a lot of cholesterol medications called statins. And here is an example of that. The review done in 2007 disclosed this. So it really can happen. But how do you perform a clinical trial without all this bias? Because the problem is that lots of these studies are very expensive, right? And pharmaceutical and medical industry companies have the money to support these studies. I think most impartial studies are done through the support from NIH and individual academic institutions, many of which receive their funding from NIH, and others who opt to accept support from industry try to eliminate or at least minimize bias in their investigations. So some ways to do that would be to make sure that the investigators maintain control over the study, the design of the study, the analysis of the study, and even its publication. So there are pharmaceutical companies and medical industry companies out there that are now starting to provide grants that are unlimited and give unlimited control to the investigators for these studies, which minimizes the bias. But even still, it's been shown that implicit bias or unconscious bias can still happen. So we need to always keep that in mind. Keep it in the back of your mind whenever you're reading a study that's funded by a medical or pharmaceutical company, okay? So let's dive into the study itself. All right, this is the abstract of the article, and it's found on the first page of the paper. The abstract is really just a short review of what the study is about. Okay, the topic to be investigated, the basic study design and its results, and the conclusions they made from the results they obtained. However, there is usually very important information in the study itself that is not contained in the abstract because the abstracts have to be brief. Now, here's the second page of the paper, and this is the introduction of the paper. So what's the purpose of the introduction? Well, it tells us a little background about the problem, why the study is being done in the first place, right? So let's look real quick here, okay? So I'm just breaking it down so we can just go through the introduction together real quickly. All right, so here it says, acute otitis media is the most frequently diagnosed illness in children in the United States. So clearly this is a common problem, right? So it's going to have a great deal of economic and medical burden in our country. Next, it talks about that it is conventionally defined, okay, recurrent acute otitis media, which is, we are going to say AOM is acute otitis media. It's conventionally defined as at least 3 episodes in 6 months or at least 4 episodes in 12 months. So they're defining the condition that they're using for this study, all right? So they're making a definition for recurrent AOM. Next, let's go down a little bit more, all right? So what supports tympanostomy, right? Because this study is comparing 2 different treatments for ear infections in kids. One of them is surgery, tympanostomy, and the other one is medical management, antibiotics. Okay, so why is tympanostomy even supported? Well, this says, by the commonplace observation, like, I've noticed after surgery of acute otitis media-free periods of varying duration. So basically, this is why doctors choose the surgical option, okay? Because they have seen that the infection goes away after surgery is performed, all right? Now, but look at all of this, right? The cost of tympanostomy, okay? There's a cost involved. There's a financial cost involved. There are possible medical consequences of the surgery afterwards. Okay, so those are reasons against surgery. Now let's look above on the right. Previous trials have given mixed results. So now what they're saying here in the introduction is, this is why this study right here is necessary, because there is a gap in the knowledge about what is available out there for practitioners to use as guidelines to make their decisions. And it also says down below, a guideline. So there are guidelines from ENT surgeons, and then there are guidelines from pediatricians that conflict with each other, all right? So there are conflicting guidelines, and that's really important because it doesn't allow medical practitioners and parents and families to be able to make a good decision as to what's best to do for a child with recurrent AOM. Okay, now this part in green talks about who the study is about. Okay, who are these patients? So they undertook the present trial involving children 6 to 35 months of age, right? So 6 months to about 3 years old, who had a history of recurrent AOM. All right, so those are the study subjects. And then what they're also doing is they're lengthening the time period for the study, okay? Because as we'll see a little bit later, the studies only had short-term results that were out there existing in the literature, and they are going to lengthen that up to 2 years. Okay, so they're starting a longer study period. All right, so let's talk about a literature review. So what is a literature review? So let's take a timeline, all right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to put our study on that timeline, okay? And a literature review tries to look at all of the studies that pertain to that subject, both before and after the study that we're interested in. And it tries to see what the existing literature is out there and why there is a gap in knowledge. So how do we find other studies related to this research area? Well, we could just do a search, but let's first look at the paper, okay? So here is the last page of the paper. So flip to the last page of the paper and you could see all their references. All right, so let's take a look at their references because after all, they already did a literature search, right? Okay, so let's look at this one in particular. All right, the diagnosis and management of acute otitis media. That was done fairly recently. It was published in Pediatrics in 2013. Okay, so what happened here? So these were actually the most recent clinical practice guidelines for pediatricians. They published it in 2013. It looks like most of the guidelines are published about every 10 years. So I would assume that the next guidelines will probably be published in the next year or two. Okay, so these guidelines also did a literature search, of course, and they searched all the existing studies so that they can make a recommendation to the pediatricians as what to do, right? So they found 3 randomized controlled trials that compared tympanostomy versus medical treatment. Okay, 2 of them found an improvement from surgery after 6 months. Remember how I said this study is following up for 2 years? That's important because these are only short-term studies. And one of them found no difference at all. Okay. One, however, there was a large multi-center study demonstrating improved quality of life measures. Okay, so their outcome measures were a little bit different. They didn't measure the medical outcomes in terms of ear infection. They measured the quality of life measures, such as hearing loss or speech impairment. So that's important too. Okay, so now let's go through another study. So here, let's look at this clinical practice guideline, tympanostomy tubes in children. We are on the last page again at their references, okay? Now, this is the ENT clinical guidelines. So what I'm going to do is, how do I take this, right, from before, and how do I search for that and find that article? Well, I'm going to go to Google Scholar. I'm going to type that in, and then I'm going to find it right there, okay? And then I read the article, or I at least read the summary of the article. What did they find? Well, they found that tympanostomy is indicated in certain conditions, like otitis media with effusion, which is just fluid behind the tympanic membrane, okay? So they can perform tympanostomy if someone has OME for 3 months or longer, okay? Clinicians can perform tympanostomy in at-risk children with unilateral or bilateral OME that is unlikely to resolve quickly. And it has effusion for 3 months or longer. But that's a little subjective too, and it's a little different than the pediatrics guideline. Okay, but now we have these 2 clinical guideline studies. They're from 2013, so let's squeeze them over there on the left, okay? All right, so let's go back to the reference page and look for another study, possibly one from a long time ago. Let's look at a landmark study from a long time ago that maybe established clinical guidelines at that time. Okay. So this one at the top center is from 1986. It's quite a while ago. I'm sure long before many of you were born. So let's dive into this one. Okay. Prevention of recurrent acute otitis media, chemoprophylaxis, which is basically antibiotic therapy, versus tympanostomy tubes. Okay. What did they find? They studied 65 children, mostly under 4 years old, for 6 months, another short-term study with a small study group, right? So the children were randomized to tympanostomy, antibiotic therapy, and placebo. Tympanostomy narrowly improved outcomes from antibiotic therapy, and both tympanostomy and antibiotics, of course, improved outcomes compared to placebo, which is what we would expect anyway. So as you can see, tympanostomy, quote unquote, won, or they had improved outcomes, but it was narrow. So let's dive more into this. That background study is going to be placed way up there since it was a long time ago. And let's go back to the references. Okay. So let's pick out another one here. Here's a study, an earlier study from 2011 by one of the main authors of this current study, actually. Okay. So it examined treatment of children under 2 years of age with AOM, acute otitis media. So what's mostly investigated here was antimicrobial treatment versus watchful waiting. So this one didn't even investigate surgery. It concluded that antimicrobial treatment with antibiotic called Augmentin, it was successful for 10 days in eliminating AOM in these children. Okay, so let's do our own search now. All right, so what I did is I just did a search for otitis media tympanostomy on Google Scholar. I limited it to studies from 2017 and later because I want to see if there are studies that fill in this gap on the timeline that we have. All right, because as you can see, there's this huge gap during the 2014 to 2020 timeline here. I'm sorry, so I did a search for 2014 and later. All right, so let's do our own search. Okay, this was a quantitative review study called a meta-analysis, which is a pretty high-level study. So it was done in 2017. All right, so I'm looking at this right now. Effectiveness of tympanostomy tubes for otitis media, a meta-analysis. So this is investigating whether tympanostomy is effective or not. All right, it analyzed 147 articles. So this was a pretty big meta-analysis. It concluded that tympanostomy improved short-term outcomes of recurrence of AOM, but the evidence in the long-term outcomes was lacking. Okay, the evidence in the quality of life improvement was also lacking. And the benefits of tympanostomy must be weighed with the risks and adverse outcomes of surgery. Okay, even though this is a very minor surgery and the risk and adverse outcomes can be minor, there's always a risk with any procedure. All right, so now we can put that in 2017 for the timeline. Okay, so you see how we can do this for a lit search, for a literature search? We just fill in the gaps, and we have to try to find, we have to find the whole puzzle. And we have to understand that in order to look at the whole picture, we have to find all the different pieces of the puzzle. So that concludes the intro, the lit review, and all the background context that surrounds this study. So next time we're going to discuss the methods of this study. So try your best to read that section before watching the next video of this series. Okay, I just have this picture up right now so that you can kind of see what tympanostomy is. All right, so there is the ear canal. You can see the tympanic membrane right there labeled at the top. And at the bottom, you can see what the tubes actually look like and how small they are. That's a dime right there. So those tubes are really tiny. All right. So I know that the methods is a really large section of the study. So just try your best. You might have to read it more than once, and that's okay. Don't worry about it. The more you read studies like this, the better you're going to get. All right. So how'd you do in the deep end today? Did you swim? Did you belly flop? All right. Email me and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, email me if you have any questions at all or you need help with this at the email on the screen. And then also make sure to just subscribe to our YouTube channel and on our website. So I will see you all in the third video. Bye, everybody.